What's cooking, everybody? I'm Dave Altizer from Kinotika, and this is Couch Talk. Today we're talking about the newly released Sony A7III. The A7III is Sony's new full-frame entry-level camera. At only $2,000, this camera is really looking like it's going to be very competitive in the market. We will be doing a full-featured review on this camera as soon as we get our hands on it, so make sure to subscribe and enable the notifications by hitting that little bell icon right next to the subscribe button. But for now, let's look at the specs. This baby's got a brand new sensor and processor inside of the A7 III compared to the A7 II. That gives us much better ISO performance, 4K video, better autofocus, and 10 frames per second burst rate. This camera does have in-body image stabilization, but Sony does say that it's not as good as the A7R III. The new sensor on the A7 III has 693 phase detect points. The same system, in fact, from the high-end A9 camera, which is really cool to see, and it's really going to help people, especially when you're shooting video, to get reliable autofocus. This camera is capable of 14-bit RAW in the uncompressed mode and 12-bit RAW in the compressed. The EVF has a 60 frames per second refresh rate, and it's a little bit less resolution than the A7R III and the A9. The A9 and the A7R III can also do 120 frames per second in the EVF, so that is one area that Sony has cut down to save money on this camera, and that's what makes it a little bit more affordable than the A9 and A7R III. One thing that I was curious to see if Sony would implement that I'm happy to see is the sunny weather mode when you're shooting 4K video. On the older Sony cameras, when you would start shooting 4K, the screen would dim to like 50%. There's nothing you could do about it. It was awful. There's no way you could ever film outdoors. The A7 III inherits this from the A7R III, which doesn't dim when you record 4K video, and it's a very welcome addition. The A7 III inherits the exact same body for the most part of the A7R III. That means that you get dual SD card slots. However, only one of the SD card slots is UHS 2 speed, and that's the same as the A9 and A7R III, unfortunately. But the biggest upgrade that I'm really excited to see on this thing is the new Z-type battery, which is giving us 710 shots on one charge. This is remarkable, and to be completely honest, I never thought Sony would ever do this because Sony's older cameras had some of the worst battery life made known to man. Now with this new Z-type battery and the A7 III, we're actually seeing the very best performance in the entire market for a mirrorless camera in terms of battery life. That is amazing. The A7 III has a mic input as well as a headphone jack, which is a welcome addition, especially as a video shooter myself. You also can shoot 4K video at up to 30 frames per second, with bit rates ranging from 60 megabits per second and 100 megabits per second. It also can shoot 120 frames per second in 1080p mode. This is great, and because this camera has phase detect autofocus with face tracking and eye tracking, this camera is going to be great for vloggers. There's no time lapse built into this camera, and that's really unfortunate. However, you can use a separate remote to trigger a time lapse, and that's really the only option you have. At the end of the day, this camera is a great value for the money. It's honestly making me consider why it's so cheap and why the A7R III is so much more expensive. This is a clear hit to Canon and Nikon and proves why Sony is quickly rising to the top. If I were a Sony shooter just based off of these specs, this camera would be the one that I would pick. Thanks for watching this episode of Couch Talk. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and enable the notifications by hitting the bell icon. I'm Dave Altizer. This is Kinotika. See you next time.